All right. Good morning, everybody. President Trump met this morning with the Emir of Qatar and discussed the agreement that he has reached with Iran to end the hostilities between the two countries. We'll play a little bit of that exchange with both him and with reporters later in the program. One thing that really struck me is that he referred to the conflict with Iran as, quote, in the rearview mirror. I don't know if that's reality, but it's interesting that that's how he is talking about it at this moment. Before we get started with the show, I did want to talk about one thing very briefly, and that is over the weekend, you may have seen that the Free Press put up an article reporting that the State Department is investigating Iranian analyst Trita Parsi, with an eye towards deporting him for his dissent against the U.S. war with Iran. Interestingly, the State Department took the extraordinarily unusual step afterwards of saying that this is not true and that there is no investigation. This comes after right-wing activist Laura Loomer has been ginning up a kind of weeks-long campaign to have him arrested and deported. And so we teamed up with our friends over at the American Conservative and Breaking Points to put together a petition that simply says, stand with Trita Parsi, do not deport him. There's nothing more American than respect for dissent. I'll put a link to this here. You can also find it on our website. There are kind of counter petitions being circulated by allies of Barry Weiss and the Free Press and Laura Loomer calling on him to be deported. It's absolutely outrageous. The State Department appears to understand the gravity of this situation, and we need to draw a line at Trita Parsi. And so if you can sign that, we deeply appreciate it. We've run this by Trita. He's supportive of this effort. This, by the way, this image that we're using here is from an AI generated video that some of his enemies produced, showing him being kind of arrested and detained. I think that as this agreement starts to come together, and as we let's say by Friday, if we enter into the 60 days of further discussions to get to a permanent end, you're going to see pro-Israel forces looking for channels for their rage. And I think one of them will be at critics, at dissidents like Trita Parsi. I think we'll also see, and I think Jeremy talked about this, I believe it was yesterday, you'll also probably see a ramping up of violence both in Lebanon, but also particularly in Gaza as they look for somewhere to take their rage out. What that says about the agreement and the kind of stability of the region going forward very much remains to be seen. And so we're going to be talking about what we understand is in the deal and what it means for the region. Jeremy Scahill, my co-founder here at DropSite, is with us. Jeremy, thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Murtaza Hussain, who's actually just coincidentally joining us from Turkey, which Israel says is its next target. So he's getting ahead of the curve there. And Sharif Abdel, Kouddous, taking a break from the daily this morning. So if you're a real daily head, is it going to be a little later? We got Roger on that instead, Sharif.
No, Roger's working on it.
All right, excellent. All right, Jeremy, wanted to start with you. Can you just give us your analysis of where we are kind of in this moment?
Yeah, Donald Trump is at the G7 summit, as you mentioned, and just first off the bat, we're starting to see what we already kind of suspected was going to be his victory narrative or his attempt to spin this. And he's saying that 99.9% of the focus of what was most important to him was Iran saying in this memorandum of understanding that it is not only not going to develop a nuclear weapon, but it won't seek to acquire or purchase a nuclear weapon. And he also is saying, and the Strait of Hormuz is going to be open. I just think before we discuss all the particulars, we have to set this in context. The 2015 JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal under Obama, if you read the preamble to that agreement, and I'll do it here, it states, and this is a direct quote from the 2015 document, Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. So that was there. The Strait of Hormuz was open before the war began. Iran was under a sweeping regime of economic sanctions before the war began. Iran had a supreme leader named Khamenei before the war began. And so Trump is flailing to try to claim this as a victory. But if we zoom out and we look at what the particulars under discussion are, I would say that, right now, obviously, the core issue to Iran is that the United States lift the military blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, that the U.S. withdraw the military forces that it amassed in the region out of the region. And then there's the financial component to it. Iran has said that it wants somewhere in the ballpark of $24-25 billion of its frozen assets repatriated to Iran. And Iran wants a $300 billion, Trump keeps referring to it as $300 million, but $300 billion reconstruction fund to be financed by countries that participated in the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. But looming over all of this is what Iran has said is a red line for any deal, any nuclear deal to take place. And that is an end to the Israeli aggression and war against Lebanon. Now, a few nights ago, before Trump announced this memorandum of understanding, an Iranian source shared what was at the time the current text of the agreement, some of the principles. They didn't share the entire thing with me. But on Lebanon, it didn't make any mention of withdrawal of Israeli forces. And of course, we talked about this on this show. I've suspected for some time that part of why Netanyahu moved Israeli forces north of the Litani River, tried to expand the Israeli occupation of Lebanese territory as much as possible, is because when the music stopped, so to speak, when Trump sort of said, okay, now I need the firing to stop right now so I can make this Iran deal, Netanyahu wanted to have his forces entrenched so that simply stopping firing, which, by the way, Israel isn't doing, they continue to bomb and attack Lebanon right up to the moment we went on the air, but that they would have their forces entrenched, and then Netanyahu would say, oh, we're going to keep this as a security buffer. That is, in fact, what Netanyahu is now saying. That's, in fact, what his Minister of Defense is saying, and there are reports that Israel is going to be sending even more forces into Lebanon. And so the Iranian negotiators have been pushing for that language, and right now we don't have the text of the Memorandum of Understanding. Some Iranian sources have indicated that there is language in the Memorandum of Understanding stating that the Israelis need to withdraw their forces. I'm suspicious of that. If it is in there, I'm impressed with that diplomatic effort. And if it is in there, it's almost certainly because Israel attacked Iran the other day. Trump and the mediators begged Iran not to retaliate, and the Iranians say they were able to get some concessions out of Trump at the 11th hour that they had been pushing for, among them something on Lebanon, something on the financial aspect, and something on the swiftness with which the U.S. would lift the military blockade on the Strait of Hormuz. But this morning, some U.S. officials began circulating what they said was the current text that's been agreed to. And I'll just read a portion. Again, this is not verified. This is what U.S. officials are pushing right now as the text regarding Lebanon. That it says, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States, together with their allies in the current war, declare upon signing this memorandum of understanding an immediate and permanent end to the war on all fronts, including Lebanon, and undertake that from now on they will not launch any hostile action against each other and will refrain from the threat or use of force against each other. The final agreement will confirm the provisions of this article and the remaining articles. Now, Mohammed Ali Shabani from Amwaj News, who was a guest on this show last week, said that he had been shown by sources a paragraph of that same paragraph that had different phrasing, that said that Iran and the U.S., quote, and their allies in the current war declare the immediate and permanent termination of military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon, and undertake from now on not to initiate any war or military operation against each other, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against each other, and this is what is the big change, ensuring the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Lebanon. That, if that's what the text says, then Iran would be arguing that occupation forces, Israeli occupation forces, simply remaining in Lebanon is a violation of the Memorandum of Understanding. What then happened? So we don't know if either of these is the real text, or if one of them is, or if it's something that is a hybrid of those, we don't know yet to what extent the Iranians were able to get more specific statements on Lebanon in, and if it would actually clearly state that they need to withdraw. But then a Hezbollah source told Reuters this morning that Iranian officials have assured Hezbollah that it will demand the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Lebanon in the next phase of talks with the United States, meaning that Iran would not go forward with a comprehensive agreement specifically on the nuclear issue unless there was a Israeli withdrawal of occupation forces from Lebanon. The reason I'm going to some lengths to kind of walk through this is twofold. On the one hand, we don't yet have the text. Trump said this morning that he would prefer to have the text revealed at his big boy ceremony on Friday, and said he may even himself read it out loud. That's what he's saying. But also because this, in many ways, in the short term, is going to be the potential deal breaker. Netanyahu and Israel are saying that they are separating Hezbollah and Iran, and that they don't recognize that Hezbollah is a part of this deal. And if Israel intensifies its attacks, particularly if it continues to bomb Beirut, which it has done a number of times over the past week plus, and the Iranians have said that that is a red line, then we could have a situation where the United States has to face the reality that Iran is saying this is a violation of the deal you signed with us, and that you, Trump, are effectively the guarantor of that side because of the language about your allies. And Israel, of course, did this war with the United States, that we have a right now to retaliate, because the Iranian position is that Hezbollah and Iran represent one camp, and the United States and Israel represent the other camp. And so if the Israelis continue to attack Hezbollah, the Iranians consider that an attack on Iran, and in fact, an attack on this deal. The issue of the $300 billion fund, Vice President J.D. Vance, who is emerging again as the person that at least is going to be the public face of the U.S. committing to this agreement on a technical level, has been preparing the groundwork for a narrative on the issue of money, because Trump said, no money's going to exchange hands. I'm not going to do what Barack Hussein Obama did. I'm not going to give the Iranians one penny. Well, clearly the Iranians are going to get not only billions of dollars in their assets unfrozen. There's a question of how that's going to be done, how it's going to be framed, but Iran wouldn't be agreeing to this MOU if that wasn't there. But then also this memorandum, the memorandum of understanding indicates, according to both U.S. and Iranian sources, that there is going to be an establishment of a reconstruction fund. Trump sort of said today that it's going to be an investment fund, and that private companies, are going to be the ones financing this, but that the U.S. initially is not going to be involved, but that it would be the right of the United States to get involved with investing in Iran if conditions change. What the Iranians succeeded in doing, remember, Trump at the beginning was saying unconditional surrender. That didn't happen. Trump was talking about ballistic missiles. That didn't happen. Trump was talking about support for Iran's regional allies has to end. They call them proxies. That didn't happen. Regime change didn't happen. None of these core things happened. And now what they're talking about is deferring, not for a long time, it's going to start imminently, that they're going to have these negotiations, the question of Iran's highly enriched uranium. Trump, for weeks, if not a couple of months, has been saying the U.S. military is going to go in and remove the highly enriched uranium. Now his narrative is a spin narrative that is basically saying what the Iranians are open to if there's a comprehensive deal, and that is dilution of the highly enriched uranium within Iran itself. Trump keeps saying things about how only China and the U.S. have the ability to dig up the nuclear dust, as he puts it. Or, maybe it's only us and China that have the equipment. But at the end of the day, if you really strip it down, Trump said, we're going to go in, seize it, and take it out of the country back to the United States. Clearly, the U.S. now is recognizing that there's going to be a much more nuanced set of possibilities placed on the table by Iran. And Iran continues to say removal of highly enriched uranium from Iran is off the table in this deal. So, the spin is what we need to look at here. But at its core, I would say that this represents a quite extraordinary set of capitulations and concessions on the part of Donald Trump. And the internal debate that broke out over the past few days among the political echelons inside of Iran was that you had some Iranian forces, they're typically referred to as hardline, but I think Iran's politics are a little bit more diverse than just that reductive categorization. But there were forces within Iran that were saying that Iran is never going to have the kind of strategic leverage over the United States that it has right now, and that this deal has too many risks associated with it in the short term. Now, what the other camp, the negotiating camp, the officials that have brokered this deal, led by Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, have essentially messaged to the Iranian public and the media is that unlike the JCPOA in 2015, Iran succeeded in breaking this into phases that allow reciprocal action, meaning if the United States does not follow through on its end of the agreements as they move incrementally through this process and deep into nuclear negotiation, that the Iranians can pull back and say, wait a minute, we're reimposing this on the Strait of Hormuz, or wait a minute, we're going to launch a retaliatory attack against Israel because you failed to restrain the Israelis and respect the ceasefire. So what the Iranian position on this is that they have baked into this process and gotten the United States to agree to segregate some of these issues so that Iran can get incrementally funds in return for actions that Iran believes are in its interest to take on either an economic or a political or a diplomatic level, or in a strategic sense in their defense of the sovereignty of Lebanon and its ally Hezbollah.
And before we're bringing in Murtaza and Sharif, I want to get your reaction to two more quick things here together. One is that on the pro-Israel side, Josh Block circulated and I put it up here, circulated what he claimed. He's one of the leading pro-Israel guys here in Washington. Circulated what he said was a copy. It is not. My understanding is that this was something that weeks ago, you would know the details better. This is something that weeks ago was leaked in Iranian media. And it's extraordinarily favorable to the Iranian side, although it doesn't include that last portion here in number 1 about respecting the territory and sovereignty and integrity of Lebanon. But otherwise, it's very favorable to Iran, and he has circulated this, I think, dishonestly in order to kind of gin up hostility from the kind of pro-Israel world here in the U.S. Meanwhile, Trump, and let me play this. Trump, I found this to be kind of revealing, and I don't know how much it actually matters, like how much it matters what is in Trump's mind. But I thought this was a revealing moment at the G7, where he is asked about, okay, well, what if the Iranians continue to kill 42,000 people every day? Then can we go back into the war? It's this kind of Western media approach to try to find other things that they can throw against the wall that will get the president to say, okay, yes, if they do that, then that's a red line, and then he's boxed into going back to war. And I thought his answer here was kind of interesting. So let me just play that.
So, yeah, I'm going to do whatever I can.
Mr. President, if the Iranian regime continues to kill their own people, will you still move ahead with this deal?
If they refuse to what with their people?
If they continue to kill their own people, the Iranian
Well, we talked to them about it, and we see. I will say the majority of that took place during the first and second regimes, much more so than now. It was much more severe, but it's a terrible thing. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yes, Mr. President.
So yeah, Jeremy, it's a terrible thing, and then he goes back to his thing. Well, we got rid of that regime. Like, why are you even asking me about that regime? We've done 2 regime changes since then. Is there anything to read about his posture towards his level of power in this moment from that answer, you think?
No, I think that if we set Trump in a historical context of American presidents going back from George H.W. Bush forward, Bill Clinton and the Democrats, and this was true under Obama as well, they felt an obligation to publicly project that their actions are motivated at least in part by humanitarian concern. The idea of humanitarian cruise missiles and these humanitarian interventions and the kind of Samantha Power worldview. And even the Bush administration, when they launched the invasion of Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11, they tried to retrofit sort of something about women's rights and freeing people, but it wasn't as sort of committed as the Democratic narrative, Democratic Party narrative is to wrapping or cloaking these operations in a humanitarian garb. And, you know, you certainly had that under Barack Obama and under Joe Biden as well at times. But with Trump, it's almost like he's throwing darts at a board. Like, oh, this sounds like a good reason why we need to do this thing. So when he first announced this war, clearly they were of the mindset in terms of their messaging, the people that were crafting Trump's message. It's a good thing to pick up from the January violence in Iran and throw that in, that we're going to lay the groundwork for you to rise up and take control of your country in Iran. And I think the reality at the end of the day is Donald Trump couldn't care less about the rights of anybody in Iran or in any other country. He's purely looking at this from an ego level, from a financial level, from a legacy level, from a kind of corrupt gangster business, family business level. So I don't think he much cares about it. He is at times. I mean, this is because Trump is a TV addict, and he's an addict of the kind of immediate satisfaction culture. It's why the guy's on the phone all day with journalists. It's why he's online constantly. He'll talk about, oh, the Iranian wrestler, or he had that whole thing about the 8 Iranian women. He'll zero in on these cases, and often the ones that he's talking about turn out to either be much more complicated than he's putting it, or in some cases it seems to be entirely fabricated. So it doesn't surprise me that he's sort of trying to find a way to say, oh, that was in the past and we changed the regime, but actually we don't want to change the regime. I don't like regime change wars, he was saying today. It usually doesn't work out, but then he wants to say we've done 2 or 3 regime changes. At the end of the day, I don't think Trump cares about any of those things whatsoever. And I think right now he's focused on trying to find a way to say that he's claimed victory. I mean, you even had this unnamed U.S. official who seems quite likely to possibly be J.D. Vance, who was saying how cool it is that we're, one of the coolest things about this process is that we get to talk to Iranian officials. Well, there's decades of the U.S. talking to Iranian officials, meeting directly with Iranian officials. In fact, meeting with some of the very Iranian officials that the Trump administration has been dealing with on this timeline. So, the very simple game here is to try to bank on the idea that people don't have any historical memory, and that they can spin, this victory narrative. But Trump couldn't care less about the fate of an ordinary Iranian person, or the civil liberties or rights of Iranians. And he only very pathetically and weakly tries to even really make that rationalization. It's something that a lot of Iranians who are opposed to the Islamic Republic government have expressed fury over. That Trump promised us, and he told us to seize the institutions of power, and then he did nothing. And in fact, he's about to make a massive deal with this very government.
Yeah. And the thing you're referring to is a pretty amusing moment where J.D. Vance has really taken the lead in being the guy whose job it is to go out and kind of sell this deal. And it clearly seems to be him, did a background briefing with reporters where he spoke in language that is so easy to fingerprint as J.D. Vance, talking about how cool it is. And we know
he then used the same language. He then used that same language on a TV show. So it's like, if it's not him, it's somebody. It's like he's
somebody impersonating him.
Yeah.
So I want to play one more clip from Trump, and Maz, get your reaction to it first, and then also Sharif, because this is about Trump being asked about and talking about Israel's war on Hezbollah, and this is interesting in about eight different ways. So let me play this clip.
Does not like them, and I'll tell you what, Israel's fighting Hezbollah too long, and too many people are being killed. And you don't have to knock down an apartment house every time you're looking for somebody, because there are a lot of people in those apartment houses, and they're not all Hezbollah, that I can tell you. Does not like them, and I'll tell you what.
And then he goes on later in the conversation, Maz, is want to get your reaction to. He's like, you know what? If you can't wage a civilized fight against Hezbollah without killing too many civilians, I'll have al-Shara do it. That's what Trump says in the conversation. I'm going to have the Al-Qaeda guy show you how to wage a more just war and prevent civilian casualties. What do you make of his criticism there of Netanyahu's approach to Hezbollah, and unpack for us a little bit about this Syria-Hezbollah relationship? Because I saw you in the conversation you were having with Sarmad the other day, talking about how even though the kind of ideology of the new Syrian government is, substantially different than the previous one, from a pure kind of strategic perspective, they actually may see Hezbollah as useful to them.
Yeah, to the first point about the Trump's comments about civilian casualties and humanitarian impact of Israeli operations in Lebanon, I totally agree with Jeremy's point that Trump does not care about that in any context per se. But it's interesting that he's leveling this criticism of the Israeli government. I think he's frustrated in the fact that very obviously Netanyahu and the current government is trying to sabotage his exit strategy from this conflict, and Iran has made Lebanon a very key part of that. So Lebanon needs to be reasonably stable, reasonably peaceful for him to leave as he sees it right now. So I think this public criticism of Netanyahu and the Israeli government and raising these moral issues as well too, even if it's cynical, he's trying to increase the pressure to get himself out of the situation. So that itself is significant because we rarely see Trump engage in public disagreement or public criticism of the Israeli government or Netanyahu himself. And he's doing so now in a format where he's sitting across from the Emir of Qatar, who has a very bad relationship with Israel as well too. It's interesting. It's indicative of the trends and the speed which he wants to end the current situation that he's enveloped in with Iran. And the second point, he mentioned that he would get the Syrian government to attack Hezbollah or invade Lebanon to deal with Hezbollah in lieu of Israel. This actually came up a few months ago. There were reports that Trump was seeking to get the Syrian government to do that. I think it's very unrealistic for a number of reasons. First of all, the Syrian government's ability to maintain control of its own territory right now is very, very weak. Outside of Damascus and a few major urban areas, they have to rely on de facto militias and so forth just to maintain a sense of authority over the territory. The idea that they could invade another country at this stage and fight Hezbollah, which is still a very robust and well-armed non-state militia group, it really is not realistic in any way, this form. But, as you mentioned too, Hezbollah right now is doing something for the current Syrian government just by default, which it also did for the previous Syrian government, which, as you mentioned, was very different. It's tying down Israel and actually deterring Israel from being able to move against Damascus or focus its military attention on Syria at the moment. The previous Assad government relied on Hezbollah to play that role, and Hezbollah is doing that at the moment right now too. Israel is currently attacking southern Syria on a regular basis. They have a de facto occupation now in southern Syria, which we wrote about, confiscating homes and demolishing them and so forth, which really began with the previous government collapsing. Hezbollah is tying them down. They're the ones fighting Israel at the moment. And as long as that's going on, Israel cannot pivot to attacking the current Syrian government or escalating its campaign in Syria or devoting more resources to the occupation of southern Syria. So it's a benefit in itself from that. And, they do have a very bad relationship, the current Syrian government and Hezbollah, but Hezbollah was very popular in Syria at one time. In 2006, when Israel attacked southern Lebanon, people from Lebanon moved to Syria, refugees in huge numbers, and they were taken into people's homes. They were exceedingly popular. It was with the Syrian civil war that all this acrimony and animosity was created between Syrians and southern Lebanese and Iranians and so forth. And yet the strategic logic of the relationship, just because of the nature of Israel and the geography and so forth, is still relatively robust. And I think it's interesting because, if you look at the video that me and Sarmad made, it was analyzing the downing of a Heron drone by Hezbollah earlier last week. And Hezbollah in that video showed that they had new military capacities, new Iranian missiles that had been provided to them, and also a very dense network of sensors. They had 4 different sensors locking onto the drone. And that all suggests that they're deploying new capabilities very late into a war. And that itself is a sign that their supply lines and the organizational structure is still robust. So throughout all this time, the big loss to Hezbollah of the fall of the Assad government was losing their supply line through Syria. But it seems like whether through neglect or by design, they're still managing to maintain supply lines either through Syria or elsewhere. they're still working. So I think that there's a certain logic to the relationship right now, which really goes against Trump's idea that Shoah is going to invade Lebanon, but also that Syrians also have an interest now in Hezbollah continuing to fight Israel, in as much as Israel is also engaging in aggression towards them.
Yep. And so, Sharif, can you bring us up to speed on the actual conditions on the ground in Lebanon? I've seen reports of people coming back, trying to come back to their homes. The level of devastation makes it such that there aren't many homes, I think, to come home to. But people can come home and rebuild, or hopefully find something intact enough to start with. What is the current situation that you're hearing?
Well, we are seeing a lot of people traveling south with their belongings packed onto cars, trying to reach their former homes. There are over 60 villages along the border with Israel that have been very, very badly damaged or completely razed and destroyed in the way of Beit Hanun and Rafah. But people are determined to go back. There are still Israeli forces there, and the Lebanese army has warned people not to go back yet while this deal is still being made. And as Jeremy indicated, negotiations around a withdrawal are still very much up in the air. But I think it's very interesting how Iran has made this a pivotal part of the MOU. We had the foreign minister today say, as Jeremy said, there's two parts of this memorandum. One side is America and Israel, and the other side is Iran and Hezbollah. And then he said, this is perhaps the most important issue in the memorandum. And I'm quoting here. He says, any military attack by the Zionist regime on Lebanon from now on, and the continued occupation of Lebanese territories from now on, will be considered a violation of the Memorandum of Understanding, in our view. So Iran is making it crystal clear that they are not allowing the US or Israel to de-link these two things. And I think, it's coming from a part of, yes, they want to protect their ally Hezbollah, but also Iran rightly views the US as completely untrustworthy after having been attacked not once, but twice in the midst of negotiations. And it also appears, Israel maneuvered the US into the war with Iran. Asking the US to, negotiate around sanctions and these things isn't that hard. Those are US policies. But Iran requiring a guarantee from the US for Israel to end its war on Lebanon, and if the US fails to do that, it means it can't be trusted to live up to its other commitments. So I think it's really, that's why it's linking these two, that's one aspect of it. Israel, of course, is trying to sabotage it. The bombing of Beirut on Sunday was this last-minute attempt to sabotage the deal. But, another reading is that may have happened with the support of the US in an effort to de-link Lebanon from the broader deal. But Iran made clear that it was going to conduct a massive retaliation, and Washington may have blinked first again and offered further concessions to Iran not to blow up the whole deal. And it must be said, finally, that Palestine has been left out of the equation. Iran does say that the agreement includes language that says to end all wars on all military fronts in the region. But it specifically names Lebanon, and it does not name Palestine or Gaza. And so I think we're going to continue to see whatever happens in Lebanon, an escalation in Gaza, where Israel is just going to take out its fury on Gaza, where no one is paying attention. The ongoing genocide is becoming more and more acute. This month, the rate of killing is much higher than others. Starvation is increasing, more land is increasing. And I think if we also look back to previous deals, this idea that Israel controls American foreign policy, I think is oversimplified and misconstrued. At the end of the day, when foreign policy interests diverge between the US and Israel, it's the US one that usually wins out. And that, was the case, for example, when Obama signed the JCPOA in 2015. This was something Israel did not want in any way whatsoever. And that deal, had snapback sanctions that would penalize Iran. This deal, the snapback seems to be in the hands of Iran. They have the Strait of Hormuz where they can penalize basically the US and the world for not abiding to the terms of the agreement. But what Obama did after he signed this deal with Iran to placate Israel is he gave Israel what was at the time the biggest funding package it had ever seen, $38 billion. And so I think in some ways we might see a repeat of that here, where Palestine is sacrificed for this deal to hold together, whatever happens in Lebanon, some kind of ceasefire, the ceasefire with Iran, and meanwhile Palestine will suffer.
Yeah. And he gave, it's an interesting parallel. Obama gave an even freer hand when it came to settlement activity. And also as it related to Saudi, he gave them a freer hand as it related to attacking Yemen. And so Obama, in order to get this deal, gave all of these concessions and then also lost the deal itself. And so, played out pretty terribly. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, just pick up a couple of things Sharif said. One, an Iranian lawmaker today was saying that, it was predicting that nothing beyond the Strait of Hormuz and kind of the initial terms of this are going to actually be implemented. And the part of the historical point he was making is to look at the Gaza deal that was signed in October of 2025. And he said, Trump likes these big ceremonies. And it's quite plausible Trump himself, he's in France right now, that he's going to stick around and he's going to go to Switzerland because he'll want to be present for this signing. Today he was saying he's going to read the thing out loud himself so that the Democrats and the fake news, don't get it wrong. But the point that this Iranian lawmaker was making, I think, is a legitimate one. If you look at what has happened in Gaza since October 2025, Trump holds this huge, bizarre ceremony in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where he gathers this assortment of leaders to sign a totally meaningless document. It was basically just a document saying Donald Trump is so great. It doesn't have any legal basis or anything. It wasn't the actual ceasefire itself. And there's all this pomp and circumstance around it. And he launches this thing. And then they have this conference with Jared Kushner doing his real estate slide presentation about what's going to happen in Gaza. And what's happened since then is that the Israelis have systematically violated every single aspect of the deal. And instead of withdrawing their forces further outside of Gaza, they've entrenched them deeper inside of Gaza, to the point where Netanyahu said the other day, we want to move towards 70% occupation on the path toward 100% occupation. So, if you go on Trump's track record, I think that nails it, which is that he's all about the front end ceremony. And I've said before, it's like if the old Hollywood sets where you're walking down the street and it looks like there's these buildings, but it's actually two-dimensional, and behind it there's just like 2x4s holding up the facade of a fake building on a set. Trump loves that stuff. So there's the Iranians are right to be skeptical of that. But on the other point Sharif was making, there is a lot of disappointment being expressed of people that Palestine and Gaza specifically have not been centered in a robust, serious, or specific way in this deal. And as I've said before, I've asked Iranian officials and others about this, Iranian sources about this, and part of what they say the answer is that on March 3rd, Hezbollah entered this war alongside Iran and became our partner in this war, and we have an obligation to our partner that has been fighting this war with us to include them in a central way in any deal. The Palestinians, they also say, are under a separate process, meaning with this fraudulent board of peace and subject to a UN Security Council resolution. And the Palestinian delegation, as we're talking right now, Palestinian negotiators continue to talk with the mediators. They were in Cairo recently. Hamas and other factions just submitted amendments to a proposal given to Hamas back in April that, from Hamas's perspective, has to deal with the fact that Israel isn't implementing the first phase of the deal in any way. And Hamas is facing these ultimatums under threat of an intense genocide resuming, that they disarm. So Hamas is deep in its own negotiations right now. And Iranians say, Hamas, of course, these are our allies. But it must be stated also that there is a pervasive lie that somehow Hamas is being controlled by Iran. Nothing could be further from the truth. Even the documents that Israelis are saying that they seized inside of Gaza, and they publish them, and sometimes they launder them through the New York Times, that purport to show this nexus of how the Iranians were actually, deeply involved with October 7th, actually show the opposite. And I think that history is going to show that while there can be allies, and while there may be some level of support for Hamas or other resistance factions from Iran, we're not talking about any significant support whatsoever in terms of material support or weapons or money or anything else. That this is an indigenous resistance movement that's very different than Hezbollah. The former general secretary of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, openly spoke about this, not with shame, not as though it was a secret, but as an affirmation that, yes, these are our partners in this struggle. So, I think we have to separate these things, but there's a lot of anger, as Sharif said. But I think it's important to also say, what is the Iranian logic on this? And what they're saying is it would require an entirely separate track, and it would also require some resolution of, are the Palestinians negotiating this process or not? Like, do they have their own peace process or their own diplomatic process? Because the one that's going on in Lebanon right now with Joseph Aoun, that Trump kind of pushed the Israelis and the Lebanese into, that's not an actual, process. The whole point of that is to try to get to Lebanize the war against Hezbollah, to try to get the Lebanese to participate in the war against Hezbollah. So at the end of the day, the last point the Iranians make is that if we're able to defend the territorial integrity of Lebanon, if we're able to include as an equal partner in this our allies from Hezbollah, and that Iran maintains its own sovereignty, that in the longer strategic reality, that this also is of benefit to the Palestinian liberation cause, because they are our allies, and we do envision another war against Israel in the not so distant future.
If you still have a moment, could you also update us a little bit on the latest in the so-called kind of disarmament talks? Like, what is, you've been reporting on Hamas's most recent kind of counters here.
I mean, our colleague Jawa Ahmad and I have been doing a lot of reporting for the last, more or less 2 years about the diplomatic negotiations between Hamas, Islamic Jihad, other Palestinian factions, and Israel, the U.S., and the mediators, etc. And basically what's been happening is that Nikolai Mladenov, who is this former Bulgarian diplomat and a former senior UN official dealing with Palestine and Israel, has been put in charge as kind of the point man of this so-called Board of Peace. And what the Palestinians are saying, and I think that this is supported also by the public record, is that Mladenov has at many times been acting as though he's an agent or a supporter of Israel. And over the past few months, there's been an enormous amount of pressure put on Hamas in particular to engage in some sort of what they consider to be a surrender ritual by giving up their weapons. And the Palestinians rightly have said that they didn't sign a disarmament agreement, and that what they did agree to was that any discussions about the arms of the resistance, the Palestinians, or any discussion about Palestinian statehood, or any discussion about the linking and the maintenance of Gaza and the West Bank as one territory, that has to be deferred and has to be subject to a much broader discussion with all Palestinian factions. And so what is happening is that the Israelis and the Americans are trying to use the veneer of the Board of Peace to try to achieve what Israel couldn't on the battlefield, which is a surrender of the entire Palestinian cause. So our understanding is that what happened in the past few days is that Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinian factions have delivered a response where they are proposing, and we've talked about this a lot, I don't need to go into details, they're proposing what they consider to be practical steps that could be taken to ensure that the interim technocratic committee of Palestinians, which is called for under the agreement, is able to enter Gaza. The Israelis are blocking them. That they're willing to make an agreement about the weapons of the resistance with the understanding that any weapons supervision or transfer would happen to Palestinian authorities, not to the Israelis, and that any issue of disarmament, actual disarming, must take place in the context of the establishment of a Palestinian state that would have an armed force capable of defending itself. So it's the Palestinians putting this forward. Now it's sitting on the desks of the American and Israeli officials. I would predict that they are not going to accept this. And then we're going to see, as Sharif said, the Israelis may decide to punish the Palestinians because of the deal that Trump is making in Iran, particularly if Trump does compel them to remove troops from Lebanon. And at the end of the day, Netanyahu said he's running for re-election, and he's being attacked even by quote unquote liberal Israeli politicians from the right, saying he's a failure, goading him. It's similar to what the Democrats are doing right now with Trump. Oh, he's capitulating to the Iranians as though they want him to, ratchet up the bombing again. The Morning Joe chicken hawks who sit there every morning saying, oh, Trump's not tough enough on Iran. This stuff is sick politics, and it's playing out in the US and it's playing out in Israel as well, where the narrative attacking Netanyahu is that he didn't murder enough people in Gaza. He's not punishing the people of Lebanon enough. He didn't do regime change in Iran and is allowing Trump to walk all over him. That's dangerous stuff. And the people that I predict will pay the highest price will be the Palestinians.
Yeah. And I'm curious, whoever wants to respond to this, I'd be curious for your take on this. But currently in the Israeli politics, it seems like there's something changing. Israeli politics and the Israeli public opinion is not static. Like it's a constantly kind of shifting beast. And the reaction of the public, I think, to this, what they see as a betrayal, like Netanyahu got everything that he wanted over the last 30 plus years, and it blew up in their face. They feel like this is a complete failure, and they feel like they've been betrayed by the United States and specifically by President Trump. And so for decades, the way that Israeli politicians sold themselves is that they were the most loyal. They were going to be the most loyal prime minister to the United States, and the United States liked them the most. Like that was kind of the card that you would play when it came to elections. Now you're starting to see the possibility of a new politics developing in Israel that says, I am the politician that has the strength to stand up to the United States. And I think you're going to start seeing a little bit more of that, not just from Netanyahu, but from others who are trying to claim the prize of leadership there, which then has its own interesting logic. In the short term, it would mean Israel kind of breaking with the U.S. when it comes to Lebanon and just continuing to attack Lebanon, ramping up attacks both in the West Bank and Gaza. Medium and long term, it has interesting implications for what the relationship is, because if they're publicly rejecting the United States consistently, I think it becomes that much harder for Israel's defenders here in the United States to continue to make the case that this is a strong ally. I don't know if anybody has thoughts on this, because the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, I think, on the other side of this is going to be different, but how it's different, I think, remains to be seen. But if it does become a thing in Israeli politics heading into this election to say, I'm the guy that's willing to stand up to Trump, who betrayed us, that has fascinating downstream implications.
Well, in this current conflict with Iran, the 2 rounds of conflict that happened, if you were to replay these rounds without the American intelligence support, and especially the ballistic missile interceptors that they provided, the war would have looked very, very differently. So this whole narrative that Netanyahu and other Israeli politicians suggest that they could be independent from the United States, I think it's extremely exaggerated, false, and they would not be able to carry out their military operations, even in the short term, at the same scale and effectiveness that they are doing right now against Iran. They wouldn't be able to occupy the West Bank as effectively, wage genocide in Gaza. And in Lebanon, they have to fight in a manner which would inflict much more casualties on Israeli troops, which they don't want to do. It's politically untenable inside Israel. So I think that these protestations, they're very, political, and there's kind of a falsehood to it. At the same time, Netanyahu has done something very interesting, because in his first campaign against the Obama-Iran deal, he started this process where the Democratic Party base, at least, is completely soured on Israel. It's like 80% unfavorable ratings in the Democratic Party towards Israel. The writing is clearly on the wall on the subject of that party. So, he made it a partisan issue, which Israelis always tried to avoid before. And he's gone even further than that now. He's made not just Israel a partisan issue, the 2 parties. Inside the Republican Party, it's very much a MAGA issue. He's made himself very closely tied to Trump, to the MAGA movement, and so forth. And now if he falls out with them, there's a very vocal and increasingly prevalent trend in that party against Israel from the right as well, too. So I think he's kind of put them in a cul-de-sac in a way. So this idea that they're going to be independent and they're going to stand up to the U.S. in the future, I think that draws on a deep, very genuine sentiment in Israeli politics. I think there is an anti-American sentiment there that's always been latent inside Israel, but they won't be able to be the same Israel without this hand-holding relationship. And I think that in recognition of this and the fact that American public opinion clearly souring on Israel on both sides of the spectrum, they're attempting to move this relationship outside of democratic oversight and embed it more institutionally into the American system. So you saw recently stories about how the IDF and Israeli intelligence are trying to build themselves directly into the American defense industrial base, make intelligence sharing mandatory with Israel and so forth, and move the aid that Israel is receiving more into these partnerships, the defense partnerships and so forth, which are opaque and could be much more lucrative for Israeli arms companies. These are attempts to move the relationship out of democratic oversight and out of public opinion, the purview of public opinion, and just make it institutional. So I think that Netanyahu did this. He kind of destroyed Israel's reputation in America and around the world with the genocide and with his interventions in American politics. Israel cannot be independent. It cannot be an autarky the way he talks about. But what they're going to try to do is try to have it both ways by having elite to elite relationships, institutional relationships, and trying to avoid the American public and their scrutiny as much as possible going forward.
I think, yeah, the only thing I would add also to what Maz said is when we talk about American domestic public opinion, it has been shattered. And if you think back, I mean, when the Second Intifada started in 2000, during that whole period, and before in the 90s, you know, there was this saying, PEP, progressive except for Palestine, that you could have progressive politics, but this was the third rail of the left in America. Now Palestine has become definitional to your politics, actually. How you think about Palestine, how you think about Israel defines or is kind of a benchmark for the rest of your politics. We're seeing it filter into Washington. I mean, Ryan, you've obviously covered a lot of this. We're seeing it in how AIPAC is viewed. How long that takes to actually affect power and change US policy is left to question, you know, how much we do have a democratic society or not, but it does eventually filter in. And I think, yes, I completely agree with Maz. Israel cannot exist as it does exist as an apartheid colonial settler state without US support. You know, it does receive arms and funding from other countries. Germany is the second largest exporter of arms to Israel, but it's nowhere near the level of the United States, and it could not sustain this level of, I mean, its answer to every problem now is war. It just wages war on every front. It's bombing several countries at the same time, engaging in genocide, you know, ethnic cleansing in Lebanon, and continuing to occupy Syria. We just published a piece about, you know, permanent displacement of people in Syria, raids, building military bases. So none of this can happen without continued US support. That support is very robust still. It's not going anywhere, but there does seem to be things cracking in Washington and certainly in American public opinion.
Yeah, Sharif,
Ryan, there was one other funny thing, and it relates in a way to what Sharif says, that Trump said when he was sitting with MBZ, the ruler of the United Arab Emirates, and a reporter asked him a question, because one of the things that Republicans have been saying is if there's going to be any nuclear deal with Iran, it's going to have to go through Congress. And a reporter asked Trump about this, and it was in the context of things that Lindsey Graham had said. And first Trump said something like, oh, Lindsey said that, I'm going to have to talk to him, like put him back in his corner. But then Trump's like, I hadn't thought about that. People can go back and watch it. He said, oh, God, I haven't thought about that. Yeah. You know what? I'll put it to Congress. And then he's like, you know what I'll do? I'll tell them, don't agree to this. Don't, because, you know, the Democrats are going to want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. He starts saying that, but he legitimately seemed to not have contemplated this issue of like having congressional authorization for, so like Congress. And then he turns to someone off camera, maybe it was Marco Rubio, and he's like, let's do that. Let's put this in front of Congress. I bring that up though, because, you know, Fouad Azadi, who is an Iranian professor at the University of Tehran that we've had on this program before, you know, and really has been criticizing accepting this deal quite publicly. He's been making this point. He's a professor of American studies. He does understand very well the War Powers Act, how congressional authorization works for things. And he's been predicting that if it does actually get to this degree, that it's going to get blocked by the U.S. Congress. This is an Iranian, American studies professor who's talking about this. But it was yet another remarkable moment where Trump was like, Congress, I never thought about that.
And the way it would work, unfortunately for Graham, is that it would go to Congress as what's called a resolution of disapproval, and that would need, you would only need like 41 Democrats or something to block that, or maybe even just more than a third. That's what they did with the JCPOA. They did a resolution of disapproval, and so you only had to kind of block the disapproval from going through. But real quickly, and we should wrap so we can go do some other work. But Sharif, on the progressive accept Palestine point, there's actually kind of a flip side of it now, because we've come so far around the corner. You've seen people, centrists like Matthew Iglesias, suggest to his kind of centrist faction, just take a hardline position on Palestine. Cares whether you agree with it or not. Just do that. Signal your support for Palestinian liberation, and then stick with all your corporate, abundance politics otherwise, which would be progressive only on Palestine. People can do their own acronym on that one. But it's really sharpening divides within the party. And next Tuesday in New York, there will be possibly 4 primaries that are determined either solely or primarily on the question of Palestine. You've got Claire Valdez, who has the support of Mamdani, running against this guy, Antonio Reynoso, who's the Brooklyn Borough president. And he's super progressive. He's got the support of the Working Families Party. He's got the support of the outgoing, left-wing Nydia Velázquez. But if he loses, then he very well may. It's going to because of Palestine. He waited until he ran for Congress to call for a ceasefire, call out the genocide. And that is being held up as, we don't trust you on anything else because you refuse to do this. Otherwise, I don't think he would even have a race. The Claire Valdez, his opponent, union organizer, would have nothing to grab onto. Adriano Espaillat is the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, extraordinarily powerful Democrat who represents Harlem and surrounding areas. Julian and I reported yesterday he's gotten a ton of recent money from AIPAC donors, $3 million in secret money going into his campaign as well, being challenged by this activist Daria-Lisa Avila Chevalier, who is being criticized for being at that October 8th protest, and is organizing her entire campaign kind of on the question of Israel-Palestine. And polls suggest she is probably going to beat him. He is going to lose on nothing other than his support of Israel. And then, of course, you've got Brad Lander versus Dan Goldman. Their politics are basically the same on everything except Israel. Where Brad Lander is kind of a liberal Zionist, but he has the support of Mamdani and is saying, I'm going to block the bombs, I'm going to cut off funding. And Goldman has the support of AIPAC. So even though he's not Daria-Lisa, that race too is being is cuts along Israel-Palestine lines. And there's even one in Hudson Valley, shockingly, that could break in a pro-Palestine direction. And so you're right. This, like, things are shifting, but as Maz said, they're trying to remove it from democratic checks, trying to take it out of the sphere of any of that mattering. We're seeing a fascinating case in Michigan where the Board of Regents there elected a kind of pro-Palestine Lebanese American and threw out somebody who had tried to prosecute a bunch of protesters in Michigan. Now the state of Michigan is trying to just cancel Board of Regents elections. Like, we'll just have these appointed. Like, why are we leaving these up to voters after all? So we're seeing this all over the place. Public will is hardening in a very particular direction, but elite will is trying to lock down the situation in its status quo. We'll see, how that unfolds.
Ryan, before we leave, there's one last thing I want to say. I mean, I much of the world watches football and is paying attention to the World Cup. And I think it's important as we, go forward looking at what's happening with this memorandum of understanding look at the way that that the Iranian national team is being treated right now by the United States, because I think it is, relevant. I was watching some of the interviews with their players who were speaking in such a dignified way about the way they're being treated. But what Trump's government has done is said they're only allowed to enter. They're making them stay in Tijuana, Mexico. And when they played last night, and the match was a draw. Iran scored 2 goals, and they're making them come into the United States to play their match. They're not allowed to bring almost any of their support staff with them, or any of the leadership of the Iranian Football Association. They have to remain in Mexico. They come in, and then immediately after their match, they were told that they had to depart the United States that instant, to get back on a bus and get out of the United States. And on a sports level, it's completely unfair. They don't get recovery time. They don't get time to prepare. But on a political level, it's sickening. And the rationale for it is that some of them might be terrorists. I mean, it's utterly disgraceful and despicable behavior. And part of the reason I bring it up is it just shows you the banality and the childishness and the pettiness of how this administration approaches all of these issues. That this football club from Iran at this moment, and they also came saying that they were playing in the names of the schoolgirls that were killed in the opening hours of the U.S.-Israeli war at Menab, and have conducted themselves in a very dignified manner. And they're very popular on social media, in part because of how they've conducted themselves. But treating them in this way is just a total embarrassing disgrace. It's shameful.
Yeah, I mean, the coach yesterday said that Iran is the most oppressed team at the World Cup. After
this is completely true.
They played, one of the most thrilling games so far, tied 2-2 New Zealand. And yeah, they had to fly in from Tijuana late the night before. They're forced to leave immediately after the game. And then when they're leaving, I think the coach, an assistant coach, and one of the players were delayed. That their security checks for them to leave to go back to Mexico. And so they're sitting, waiting in the airport to go back. So yeah, it's quite atrocious and shameful.
It's petty and cowardly. It's not the kind of thing that somebody who won a conflict does. It's what somebody who lost one does. In the spring, the World Baseball Classic was here in the United States, and Cuba's team was denied 8 visas, but including specifically their ace pitcher. Like that's how pathetic and pitiful the United States is. Like, they had to insist on blocking the top Cuban pitcher from coming and playing. Like, there are no words for that level of kind of cowardice. And
FIFA, FIFA's long been one of the most corrupt bodies in the world, but somehow the current head of FIFA, Infantino, is somehow more corrupt than Sepp Blatter, his predecessor. He's the guy who gave President Trump a peace prize. He attended.
He was at the Gaza deal. What's he doing there?
He attended the Board of Peace inaugural meeting or summit, and pledged for FIFA to help Gaza rebuild. And FIFA agreed to allow the US to do this. Iran asked that their matches be played. This World Cup is for the first time being played in 3 countries, in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And they asked for their matches to be moved to Mexico and Canada because they foresaw some of these problems. FIFA disagreed. FIFA has allowed all of these things to continue happening. And just on a pure sports level, football is not played in quarters. We don't have these hydration breaks. This is purely for ads. And it's really very strange as a longtime football fan to watch a match and it breaks after a quarter. I mean, that alone should register him to be fired.
Yeah, deeply corrupt. Yeah, I think Americans are like, wait a minute, why is this game going on so long? Where are my ads? Okay, like they don't feel comfortable watching it without the ad breaks. So, all right. Well, Maz, Sharif, Jeremy, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. Always great to see you guys. That'll do it for us here at Dropsite. I'm Ryan Grimm on behalf of all of my colleagues. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for supporting. The only way we can continue to do this is through the support of readers, which you can either do that through dropsitenews.com, become a paying subscriber there. You can do it on YouTube. That's where you're watching this. We can also take donations, which are tax deductible, but Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. Talk to your tax person. On behalf of all my colleagues, thank you so much for joining us today.